Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Joining us now for this one-on-one interview. Actually, it's a one-on-two. When I say one-on-one, I mean Jeff and Dennis aren't here. I'm very thrilled. You know, we've had a lot of people on this podcast, a lot of authors, screenwriters. We get to talking about research, how to research to do a book, research on how to get all the authenticity for a screenplay, or even researching your relatives and the role they played in the war. But I think, despite the fact we've had Luke on here multiple times, I think it's the first time we've had the opportunity to talk to two gentlemen who've done research, but not for a book, not for a screenplay, but something just as important, if not more important, to this hobby, and that is bringing artifacts back from the dead so that we can wear them as part of our impressions. And I'm wearing the one we're going to talk about today. So joining us right now to go down the whole story of how this came to be, what it goes into reproducing authentically stitch correct garments from World War II for modern day use. Join us now is Charles, I love this part, Charles W. McFarlane. You got to keep the W. You know, my name's Donald Preston Abernathy, and I used to joke around as a kid. That's not the type of name you can put on a mailbox in front of a double wide trailer. Donald Preston Abernathy. So Charles W. McFarlane and his friend Josh Kerner. Josh, Charles, how y'all doing tonight?
Doing great.
Gentlemen, let's talk about this awesome 2 episodes in a row now. I'm pointing out that I've been wearing this, the Jungle Sweater. And first thought is, fellas, why not just go online and type in World War II reproduction jungle sweater and order one off of eBay somewhere? Why go through the hassle of recreating this? I mean, they're all over the place, clearly, right? I mean, I see them on Amazon, I see them on Temu, I see them. Oh, wait a minute, no. Actually, when I was researching this show, after I got this one, I had that same very question. I saw one that said World War II jungle sweater, and I noticed it had the thick vertical cords like an Irish garment, holes in it. I was like, no, that's more like 1980s military sweater. So why go through the hassle of recreating this when you can clearly just buy them any old place?
I mean, I think simply, like, I think there's only been one reproduction run of jungle sweaters, and that was from, correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, that was QMI, right?
Yeah, QMI did a very, very, very small run like 6-7 years ago, and that was a real flash in the pan.
Did they do that for a movie production?
I don't think so. I think they just did it because the guy wanted to have them, and I don't think he probably was small enough that it was like the minimum size as like a test strike from whoever his manufacturer is overseas, and that's why it sold out so quickly, was that there wasn't much to sell, and because nobody really expressed interest in him at the time, he had no real inkling to go back to that well.
It's kind of something that's kind of a paradoxical, I think, in a lot of repros, which is we get a lot of repros of the stuff that you can find relatively easily, and it's the stuff you can't find at all that we don't get any repros of, because usually there's not one knocking around for someone to take apart.
No, and the one series that could have had them would have been the Pacific, but they don't really have them, and that kind of is the inkling for why we started on this road, was that the initial plan was to have them for the backhander event, which is was part 2 of what's going to be a quad event series following the 1st Marine Division from Guadalcanal through Okinawa, and backhander being essentially part 2 of that event series, and the 1st Marine Division getting a large number of these as part of that event. And Charles got intrigued by this and kind of decided to take the reins in getting it reproduced. And that's kind of was the inkling what kind of got this project started.
Josh kind of approached me with this project in mind, like, kind of my background, kind of I've worked kind of in and around the garment industry for, almost 10 years now, on and off in different capacities, both like covering it in a media perspective and then also kind of working inside of it. So I kind of had kind of a loose network of people that I could call on for some help. And Josh kind of brought the project to me, and we kind of ran with it together.
So to give some historical background on this garment for people who aren't familiar with it, the jungle sweater is its colloquial name. Its official name was shirt knit olive drab, and it was originally developed for ski troops. In 1942, the U.S. Army at first had a very heavy long underwear shirt, and the mountain troops that were being developed at the time, they're like, this is overly heavy. You can't really adjust how warm it is or cold it is when you're doing all this physical exertion. And the Army went about designing this lightweight knit shirt that has a button collar neck and also is importantly an olive drab green, because at the time the underwear was still white, which lacks any camouflage qualities.
Mm-hmm.
And in August of 1942, Stilwell goes to Washington D.C. on a stopover, eventually going to the China Burma India Theater to start to look at the Office of Quartermaster General for all the stuff that he will want to outfit jungle troops. And there hasn't really been any specifically designed jungle equipment besides some stuff that had been tested in Panama in late 1940 and 41. And going through there, he actually chooses a number of interesting items that will become things that we can't picture fighting in the jungle without. And one of those, there's the jungle food bags that start off for mountain troops. There's the poncho, which for a place that doesn't get any rain was initially designed for desert troops. Funnily
I
enough,
guess maybe for a sunshade, like if you had time, you hurry up and wait. Like, okay, dig your foxholes and then put up your sunshades.
And then he saw the jungle sweater, the knit shirt, and was like, this will be more useful than like a heavy wool blanket in the jungle, because it's hot in the jungle. However, when it rains, when you're in the highlands, it will still get cold enough, and a lightweight knit wool shirt will keep you warm enough and will not be as hot and bulky as a blanket and will not be as hard to carry. So they chose that, and it kind of just rolled on from there. So by December of 1943, it's not even a mountain warfare item anymore. It's purely a jungle warfighter item.
Anybody who's ever done a living history event, who's even slept out on the ground in Ohio, knows that when Sunday comes and you pull that wool blanket up, you have every leaf, twig, stick, spider web stuck to that thing. They're unwieldy and they're Velcro. And so it makes sense that if you can minimize, if not alleviate, wool blankets and find an alternative to that, they get heavy, especially when they're wet, and B, they get snagged on everything. And so it makes perfect sense.
Exactly.
Yeah, and Josh kind of alluded to this too when he was kind of talking about how they were adopted, but kind of, you hit on it, right? Which is that when wool's wet, it insulates, as opposed to cotton, which would be like, the HVT uniforms, right? Like these wool knit shirts are going to insulate you in the damp and in the cold in a way that no other kind of cotton garment could possibly do.
And no one says it better than Robert Leckie when he's explaining the goofy look on his face when he's laying on his cot wrapped up in his wet blanket and he's smiling because it's so warm, because there they are in the jungle. They've been freezing in Cape Gloucester, but he discovered that nothing's warmer than a soaking wet wool blanket. And so he just laid there like a kid on Christmas, just snug in his wet wool blanket.
Yeah, and so these got, like I said, really popular. They became part of the Army's jungle clothing list, which meant that the 1st Marine Division got a large number of them in preparation for the invasion of Cape Gloucester. But Army troops wore these from the jungles of Burma to Bougainville, and the Marines wore these not only in Cape Gloucester, but through the end of the war. We know, for instance, John Basilone specifically had one, and there's film footage of them unloading John Basilone's haversack after he was killed in action on Iwo Jima.
Yep.
And one of the first things they pull out of it is his jungle sweater. So these were used from Cape Gloucester through Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the whole time frame of the war.
And let's not overlook, and I was talking to Charles about this on Facebook, because I got into the Merrill's Marauders a few years back, and I wanted to work on an impression. They were used in Burma, and it's actually pictured and explained in this little cute thin book plus the novel I have, that basically the soldiers could wear whatever they want. They had to carry certain amount of ammo. They had to carry an M1 Garand, and I think they could either wear boots or jungle shoes. But as far as the pack goes, they could choose whatever pack they wanted. Most of them chose a musette bag, and most of them had a jungle sweater, HBT jacket, the HBT pants with the cargo pockets on it, leggings, boots, and Daisy May, as well as their helmet. And then when it came to fighting knives and machetes basically everybody had, but they packed everything in and out on mules, and so they relied heavily on their jungle sweater because they spent for the kind of like the Raiders, they had a short shelf life, but while they were in action, you know, they were more self-contained than the Raiders were. They were dropped off and left alone.
Oh yeah, and for sure. And the usage and love affair that the military had with these didn't end with the war. For instance, here I have my collection of jungle sweaters, and this one is an original that was manufactured in 1948. And then this is
Hold that up again. Hold that up real quick for our YouTube audience.
And let me get a good view of the label here.
That's what we need. Yeah.
is we'll get to that later because yeah, we'll get to the label later. Maybe that's where that came from. That's where they saw that.
And then another one, and you could kind of see from the color, they even made it into Vietnam, and they stopped producing them in 1967. And the Vietnam ones are distinguishable because the World War II, the post-war ones are this brown OD number 33 color, and then in the 1950s they switched to OG 208, which is this greener color that's different than the olive drab of the World War II. But these were used in Vietnam right until the adoption of the tricot nylon sleep shirts that everybody is familiar with and sees all the time in surplus shops. So this and once you see the sleep shirt, you kind of see the common heritage, but it kind of shows like this was a really popular, useful item, and you could see that today in how many times you could go to the Smart Wool catalog or whatever and see essentially the same product being sold to hikers and outdoorsmen for almost exactly the same purpose, a lightweight wool shirt to use in the outdoors that will keep you warm despite when it gets wet with sweat and everything like that.
Now, with the exception of the color change, as far as cut, materials, buttons, was there any major improvements, for lack of a better phrase, or deviation from the original?
So the changes, there's changes in the colors, of course. There's changes in the buttons, and the buttons change both in color that kind of mostly correspond to the color change of shirt. So when it's OG 208, they choose a color that matches the color of the shirt. When it's OD number 33, they choose a color that kind of more matches the color of the shirt. But early during World War II, the color changes, even though the shirts stay mostly the same color, and it mostly has to do with the specific type of plastic that they're using. It's going from a vegetable-based plastic to a more synthetic plastic as the war is going on, which we replicate in having so this is actually the original that we sent to China to help get these reproduced, and it sacrificed a button and some stitching on it. And you could see they replicated the early color here. Here's the reproduction. Got it pretty much dead on matched.
While we're talking about buttons real quick before we change, did the Vietnam era continue with the 2-hole button, or did they say let's go 4-hole for longevity and durability?
Nope, they continue to use the cat eye buttons.
Okay, so they still did, because I know like on the Vietnam era like blouses and stuff, don't they use the 4-hole buttons on a lot of that stuff?
Yeah, and when they do the tricot sleep shirt, they use the 4-hole button as well. But yeah, so this is the early war. This is another early war one that has the lighter color, and like I said, it's just a change in the formula of the plastic. But the biggest change in cut is the earliest war ones are about 1.5 to 2 inches longer in the body to make sure that they kind of stay tucked in, which gives them a really long look. While the later Vietnam one,
there you go. Yeah.
Now, let me say, as somebody who's 6'5", I can appreciate a long waist.
So you could see, here's a Vietnam one.
Great for concealed carry, by the way. Go ahead.
My World War II one.
Oh, wow. That's tremendously shorter.
Yeah. And I don't know. I've never gotten to handle QMI's reproductions. I don't know how many other people kind of knew of that change before we kind of delved into this project. And I think being able to make sure we have the very early one that actually has the extra length, which makes it more usable for tall guys in the hobby, which often guys are at the short end of the stick. Ah,
So when you guys came up with this idea, hey, these sweaters existed, they were issued, we they're not available, but we want this authenticity. How do you guys get from this conversation to actually getting this done, and what's the steps in between?
so I think the first two steps were the steps that I took, which was one, having, I had at this point 4 or 5 original ones in very good condition, which makes me more willing to send one off across the world to as a sample. The other big thing is for, God, a decade now, I've been going to various archives across the East Coast and digitizing documents relating to the quartermaster corps during World War II. And one of the documents I had scanned was the specification for this garment. And we're lucky that while many of the cut and sew clothing specifications are a little bit more general and hazy on some certain measurement details, the knit garment ones are extremely specific and give you all the major necessary dimensions, where it tells you how long this seam has to be on the sleeve, how long the body seam has to be, where the buttons are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, in very detail, and not just for one size, but for a whole schedule of sizing, meaning that someone like Charles can take that World War II spec document and kind of convert it into something that a modern manufacturer is used to working with. And you take that research, you bring it with an original garment that they can use for both color samples for the wool, for the weight of the wool, for the buttons, and to check off some more minor measurements against the spec sheet. And it makes life a lot easier, and allowed Charles to do what he ended up doing.
Clearly, Josh has a high passion for garments and the history. Charles,
Totally.
how do you get brought into this, and what part of this ball do you pick up and run across the field with?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like, again, like kind of like backing up a lot, like, Josh and I have known each other since we were 12. We've been reenacting together, since we were 12 years old. So kind of the history
I'm 30
goes,
now, so we've been doing this. Our
kind of,
friends
yeah,
enlisted in the army.
yeah. So, that kind of, we go back, a long, long ways. And I think also kind of before we get to what I was doing, I think it also just speaks so much to kind of Josh's, kind of the way he does his research, right? Because like you scanned this spec, what, like, 7 years ago, well before we knew we were going to do this project. And I think that's the kind of the part of it too, just like being able to like hoover up the information when you have access to it is such an important key to kind of like, we just got lucky in a real way. Because I think, Josh, I think you can attest to this. Like, I think the archive where you got this spec from, I don't know if you could get in there today.
I do not know if I can, because of just the way things have changed and the personnel has changed over and everything like that. It was a lucky time, and I had a friend make it so we were able to get most everything we could out of there in the short time we had.
Like, that's such a big part of this story, is like having that available.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so Josh comes to me, my first instinct, again, kind of as I said, I've kind of worked, I'm in New York City. I've worked in, in the garment industry here and there, mostly like, kind of, I don't make things, I write about things. So that's mostly what I've been doing, but working with people who do make things quite a bit. So my first instinct was, all right, so let's get these made here. Let's get them made, maybe we can find a close enough jersey. We can find, someone who can make these, maybe in, I was working with a company at the time that was doing a lot of knitwear in Peru. I thought maybe, that would be a good, bet. But really kind of what it came up to was, we couldn't find something close enough. We couldn't find, the order minimums were too high, was another one. And frankly, for what it is and for the people who are gonna, be our customers, it was gonna be too expensive. And we were faced with this impasse. I mean, again, I think, this project took way longer than, we all expected. So, I think kind of to ruin the ending a little bit, we did not get these sweaters in time for Backhander. So, basically we were confronted with this thing. So, all right, so what could we do, right? We can't get these things made here at a price point where we think people are going to buy into them. So that price point, by the way, was like looking at like upwards of like $300, for example, right? So not only do like, we don't have the capital to put up to like get to that stage, but we also
500 of them.
Sorry?
You needed like 500 of them, and each one would have cost $300 each. It was like, okay,
there's no room for margin in that.
Exactly, yeah. And it also, frankly, would have been a lot more labor intensive for us. I cold reached out to Bronson, and I kind of I sent them a DM on Instagram, and I kind of just laid out the argument for, like, this is who I am. This is the kind of stuff I've been up to. This is a product that, I think you guys should bring to market. The reason is because no one has made this before except for this very limited run. When I think about people who they are trying to emulate, I'm thinking about people like the Real McCoys or Buzz Rickson. Neither of those companies, kind of the gold standard for, high-end repros, neither of those companies have touched this product. This could be a really interesting, product for you to bring, to the space. So they were interested, which was great. And basically what I did from there was and Josh alluded to this already, is I took the government spec, the quartermaster spec from 1942, which is what, like maybe like 10 plus pages, would you say, Josh?
Yeah, that's about right.
And that, and again, Josh kind of alluded to this. It doesn't just lay out kind of how to make the garment. It lays out how to, how we're going to fold these things, how we're going to bale them into a size tariff, and how we're going to put them in a box, and how that box is going to get labeled.
Stuff that Bronson doesn't care about.
yeah. Stuff that like I don't care about, but so,
there's only one person on this call that cares about that in any shape, way, or form.
Yeah. So
it's funny you say that, because
I pour through this document,
yep.
And basically look for the things that are relevant for a modern day tech pack. So like a tech pack, kind of like, maybe I'm not like the best person to explain this, but essentially what it is, it's not a pattern, but it is a kind of, it's mostly on like, the way it's done now. It's mostly a spreadsheet, multiple, slides on a spreadsheet. And it's just going to kind of lay out like, the real, like, bare bones to details of what this garment is, right? So again, we're not doing, a pattern, right? Which would be like your outline, but you're going to say like, okay, so for size 40, it's going to be 19 pit to pit. This is how to measure pit to pit. Here's a diagram of the, this is all the stuff. This is the kind of buttons we need. This is the button placement. It's all like that kind of stuff. But there's a very clear template that's used in modern garment manufacturing.
How do you make that conversion? Because I have found that when it comes to measurements, things have changed over the years. For example, if you go, a couple years ago, I found a pair of new old stock skivvies. Guy had a bundle of them. I ordered a pair of size 35 because that's what, or 36 because that's what I wore at the time. Turned out in 1942, I was a size 40, a size 36. And so how do you, because I guess maybe because you're experienced in the garment industry, how do you know the adjustments to make from sizing, or was the original documents just based off of pure math in inches and centimeters?
So the first rule that we kind of had going into this, and I think, what, a lot of people, have said how kind of great the sweaters look kind of side by side as far as like the knit and everything. But what I really kind of get jazzed about, which is that they measure exactly as the specification laid out. So from the very beginning, we were not going to mess with the original measurements. And like, Josh can speak to this a little bit more, but essentially no one has ever made a reproduction based on like the paper specifications, having it in hand. Right.
That's awesome.
Everyone has kind of done the thing where you take a garment and you cut it apart, and you kind of
reverse engineer it.
You cut apart a 40, for example, right? You have a pattern from a 40. Let's say like let's say a wool shirt, right? And then you bring in someone called a grader, and that grader is going to look at that, and he's going to make the adjustments to the pattern for the different sizes, up and down, right? So that, that's a whole job that someone has, right? That's all they do is pattern grading. But, when we had the measurements, we're going to say like, we do not want to mess with these at all.
Don't deviate from the recipe.
Yeah.
Exactly.
We
So
want
like,
grandmother's
our
pie
size
here.
40 measures out to that size 40, to the original size 40, right? Something that we kind of bumped into with Bronson and kind of caused like, one of a handful of like small delays in the process was they were adamant about shortening the sweater, right? Because they were like, these things are really long.
We want
Like,
them long.
because again, you have to think about what they're thinking of, right? Which is they're thinking about more like casual streetwear, kind of, again, like a Buzz Rickson type audience, right? But like, that's not what we're going for here, obviously. So we kind of had to have a real back and forth. And what they decided on is they were going to do our run of 150 to our exact measurements. And then the next ones they do, they're going to do their thing.
Which is fine because that makes yours all more sought after and for what we do more authentic. And it
Yeah.
makes
Yeah.
me feel lucky that I got in on the first run.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the key things is that, well, some reproduction, to go to Charles and the grading, some reproduction companies have bought, instead of just 140, they've bought in like a 40 and a 42. But the thing is garments get washed,
Mm-hmm.
garments stretch from use. There's always tolerances and tolerance stacking. Sometimes you have garments where, oh, and I own some of them, and it's funny where where you get it, you might not know it, but you get a defect original where the person on the factory floor made an oopsie, and instead of putting 6 inches of room here, they only put 3 inches of room here. And when you have all those sort of problems, it might not just fuck up your size 38. It could that can then scale out where you mess up all the range of sizes. And there's one garment manufacturer, or they don't know what the steps are between a small and a medium and a large, and they just base it off of modern conventions. And there's a current, I'm not going to name the company, but there's a current company that just dropped a reproduction where their size large, it has the measurements for an original size small. And it's because they didn't understand how much bigger in the chest the size small was supposed to be because it was a winter garment. And that's the sort of problems that we were able to avoid by going with the original. And there was discussions, of course, with Bronson, and other reproduction have had these sort of discussions where it's like, well, how do we fit the modern man?
Well, I
How
was
do
going
we-
to say that.
Yeah.
I can imagine one of the things Bronson will do on their run, because even though they want to make timeless clothing that has a vintage look, they understand that modern day people have a modern day feel of what they think is correct. And as you stipulated, they're probably going to shorten the length, but I imagine they're going to lengthen the arms. Because
Yeah.
I'm 6'5", I love the length. Now I could sit here and say, well, the sleeves aren't long enough, but for what we do, that's the authentic length of the sleeve. But I have
Yeah.
long arms, so my watch shows. People like to be able to bring their sleeves down and cover up their thumbs and do the whole hide the hands like they're teenagers thing. So I can imagine they won't go that long because they want to keep the appeal. But I can definitely imagine they'll probably want to add maybe 2 inches to theirs so that their mass consumers will have the modern day feel and appearance of a modern day garment with a vintage look, whereas we want the authenticity. If it has a shorter sleeve, maybe because the military didn't want your sleeve getting in the way, or they had a intention for the design to pair with the other uniforms that you're going to wear on top of this stuff.
And that's a kind of like that kind of goes into two things. One, you have the problem, and you're experiencing it, that, well, the U.S. military during the war made some garments in different lengths. Some garments didn't make in any lengths. And this was a one size fits none in terms of length. If you were between 5'7" and 6'1", this is going to be pretty damn close as a regular. But if you were outside of that range, if you're Michael Phelps, you're out of luck.
The P-41 trousers is a perfect example of that. And it makes sense. They had certain waist size, but it was essentially one length fits all, because why, when you're trying to mass produce uniforms for combat, why retool to have 15 different lengths when you can have one length fits all? You give it to the guy and they go have it hemmed. You have it shortened and hemmed. And I was reading a post the other day saying, well, I got some P-41s from somebody and they're super long. It's like, Yeah, so you can take them to a tailor and get them hemmed to the appropriate length.
Josh, a few years ago, did this great series on kind of like fitting the uniform for like, for our 100th page. That was like, what was that, like 6 or 7 years ago at this point?
Yeah, it was 6 or 7 years ago, and what I use is the U.S. Army had a somewhat similar problem at the early in the war, where civilian fashion fits were just different enough from the Army clothing fits that it was creating some problems. And they also, as opposed to being a small regular army, and thus you had people that were in the army forever and knew how army clothes was supposed to fit, they were having to train people how to get people into clothing to fit the army way, who may have only been in the army for a month. So they actually issued out detailed army regulations about how to measure and fit uniforms for the soldier. And basically, we took those army regulations and created a photo interpretive guide to basically lay out in plain English what each step of that regulation is saying, so you can kind of go through and be like, oh, this is how the service coat is supposed to fit. And for instance, you were talking about sleeve lengths. Shirt sleeves were meant to kind of fall at the wrist bone, because on a suit today, you're supposed to have about a matchstick's width showing from beyond your suit jacket cuff. On an army dress coat, your sleeve isn't supposed to show.
Yeah.
It was meant to fall at the wrist bone, and that also has knock-on effects about not getting in the way when you're doing stuff with your hands and fighting and stuff like that. And we kind of did that to help educate some people about like the proper fitment. And that's kind of like, I think important thing to keep in mind is that not a lot of people have kind of know that stuff, and I think more reproduction manufacturers should just try to get their consumers a little smarter.
I can't remember the exact publication, but essentially like a trade publication for the garment industry from, basically towards the end of the war. The end of the war is in sight. And the topic of the article is basically like, how are we going to get these guys dressed after coming out of the army, right? So what does the garment industry need to do? And one of the things that I think really stuck out to me in that article is they talk about like the average soldier coming out of the army is going to be accustomed to a much higher level of craftsmanship of their clothing than they would have been in civilian life. And that's something that like the garment industry is going to have to rise to meet, because it's like, again, kind of, we can all kind of joke about kind of, nothing ever fitting, or like, everyone's the same size in the Army of 9, but like, that's not really the way the Quartermaster Corps was operating. And guys were getting accustomed to a very, very, like, just a very high quality, uniform, right? And a uniform for basically every kind of weather condition and every kind of climate. And guys were coming out of the service ready to be, kind of served and dressed in a certain way that, the garment industry was paying attention to. So I think it is like, important to note how, basically, cutting edge the Army really was at the time.
And to that point, when the Quartermaster Corps did a survey of soldiers in 1944, one of the top questions was, are you happy with the fit and fitment of the uniform you're currently wearing? And something like 90% of the soldiers answered yes. That like,
crazy.
It was insane, which is not as insane as a baseline, but all the more insane to realize the full scale of human sizes that you are getting for it. This was not a volunteer army. This was a drafty army that was taking in the full range of everything from short Nisei soldiers going into the 100th Battalion to large giants being recruited from the upper Midwest. And they were all being fitted in uniforms to a degree that they were like, yeah, I am happy with the way this fits. And it's an impressive logistical feat. And it's one of the things where I think not a lot of people really appreciate that. And it's one of the small things. It's like the ice cream ships during World War II that really speaks to the industrial power and might and logistical acumen that allowed us to win the war.